Good afternoon, good morning. We're gathering here for a couple of minutes as you all roll in. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Good afternoon, and if anybody's that far west of me, good morning. We'll get started in just about one more minute here. Let a few more people gather. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we're going to look back a little bit and celebrate 10 years of Net Plus, and also spend a little bit of time looking forward as well. Just a couple of logistical reminders. Today's webinar is being recorded, and it would help us if you stayed on audio mute so that the recording is as clean as possible. And we'll be working on turning around the recording as quickly as possible. So if you have colleagues and friends that weren't able to make it real time today, there'll be an asset to share a little bit later. By all means, we welcome your questions during the webinar today. Some of you have submitted questions ahead of time, and the panelists have had a chance to look those over, and we'll be going through them as well. But I really do encourage you to riff off of what's discussed today and put it in the chat window, and I'll be monitoring that and trying to work that into the conversation as well. So with that, Emily, did I capture everything before we dive in?
You did indeed. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. All right, great. So my name is Kevin Morooney, and I'm a vice president here at Internet2. I do things associated with in Common and also Net Plus, and that's why I'm here with you today. And I'm joined by several of my colleagues in the community and also internal to the team here at Internet2. Sarah, Bobby, Jack, and Sean are going to help us have this conversation today. And as a starting point, I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves very, very quickly. Just give everybody a little bit of context, what you do, where you are, and how it is that you're connected to the higher education cloud community, and also how you're connected to Net Plus. So let's just maybe go in the order we have it here. Sarah, tell us who you are, Sarah.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, I'm Sarah Christen. I'm the Director of Infrastructure at Cornell University. Let's see here, how I've been involved in the cloud community. I started the Cloud Forum, I think 7 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, which has sort of grown and changed over the years, but it's been a really good way to bring different institutions together to talk about infrastructure as a service primarily. So we really focus on how to build infrastructure in the cloud and how to transition institutions from their sort of local data centers into the cloud, and how that can, help the institution grow and innovate. And so those conversations we have that once a year, we have that conversation. Internet 2 has been very involved in that since the very beginning. They've helped with planning and participation and all of that. I'm also part of the CSTAAC organization where we discuss cloud contracts and how to help navigate the negotiation of cloud contracts for higher education. And so that's my involvement.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sarah. Bobby, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, glad to be here. My name's Bobby Clark. I work at Clemson University. I currently work in CCIT Procurement. CCIT is our central organization, and vendor management. I'm also on the BPLAC advisory committee as the current chair, and I'm happy to be doing that for the last 6 months. And then if you look over my shoulder, we have another venture that I'm involved with Internet 2 called MSCC, which is Minority Serving Cyber Infrastructure Consortium. And we have just won an NSF grant, and hopefully we'll be talking within and working within with Internet 2 to broaden our message to many other people who have not seen Internet 2 as an option. So I'm glad to talk about it. I think Net Plus is a very important part of what we've been doing to make that message, and I'm glad to have this conversation today.
Great. Thanks, Bobby. Jack, who are you?
Who am I? I'm Jack Suess. I'm Vice President of IT at the University of Maryland-Baltimore County, or UMBC as we like to call it. My connection to Net Plus really sort of, I would also say I'm the unofficial historian in that I was sort of one of the few people that's still around who was part of there as Net Plus was sort of being birthed, so to speak. At the time that was happening, I was very involved with In Common and Common Steering, and I was also on the Internet 2 board of directors. And so much of the early work as to launching Net Plus, I was there for watching that. And so I'll talk a little bit about that early stage. Oh, and I should also add, I am now on the Net Plus Advisory Committee, and so I'm involved in some of the ongoing activities today.
Great. Thanks so much, Jack. So like Jack, I was around some of those birthing moments that he was talking about, but only for the last 2 or 3 years have I been in this Net Plus role, and it's been really great to learn from and work with Sean. Sean, tell us a little bit about your job at Internet 2.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sean O'Brien. I'm director of the Net Plus program here at Internet 2. I've been at Internet 2 and working on the Net Plus program and cloud services for a little over 7 years now. So I've been here the majority of the 10-year history of Net Plus, and have worked in various roles in Net Plus. And in the last 2 years, I've had the privilege of heading up the program. So really my role here today is just to say, thank you to the staff, the Net Plus staff that are on the call. We have some former staff and former leadership on the call, and of course appreciate all of your contributions. And then finally, the community. We could not have built this program and couldn't sustain this program without the countless volunteer hours higher ed folks put in, and without all the work the cloud service providers have put in working with us as well. So appreciate you all joining. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Sean. And before we dive in completely, I'm so glad in the introductions, everybody's been able to connect themselves to Net Plus. We have built out a really rich series of advisory groups and bodies. And not only do we have the panelists connected to Net Plus in those ways, but we've got some attendees today as well. And while we don't have the opportunity or time today to acknowledge all of them, just want to thank them for the passion and volunteerism that makes this go. So thanks to the rest of you on BPLAC and CSTAAC and the PAG who have showed up today as well. So as Jack indicated, to get us started, we thought it would be a really good idea to just get a little bit of a historical context in the very short period of time we have today. So I asked Jack to paint a little bit of a picture about our origin story in Net Plus, because I think that's really important, because you can draw lines from everything that's happening today back to those origin stories, and I think that will inform the part of our conversation that's about the future. So Jack, tell us your version of the origin story of Net Plus.
Well, and I think your point of my version is like all history, it's from the eyes of the beholder. And so as we have views of this. I'm sure others will come forward and say, well, I thought it went this way or this and that. So this is more my perspective. But, I take a lot of the lineage for this back to really 2010. And so in February of 2010, EDUCAUSE, Richard Katz at that time had put together a group that was coming out to Tempe in mid-February, February 10th, and it was going to be a cloud summit. And so this was NACUBO, it was EDUCAUSE, a lot of Internet 2 related CIOs were there. It turned out I missed that meeting because that was the week that Baltimore happened to get 60 inches of snow between 28 to 30 inch snowfalls, and no flights were going out of BWI. But they ended up producing at that meeting a white paper that came out in May. And I'll put in the chat the white paper if you want to go back and look at it. But what it really highlighted was that the higher ed community had to begin thinking about how we were going to be cloud first and how we were going to come together to be thinking about joining forces. Because if we were trying to all do things individually, we weren't going to achieve the success that we could if we came together and we worked collaboratively. And so it really was sort of what I would call a call to arms for the community to begin thinking about that. There were some beginning software as a service vendors. There were other things that were starting to happen, nascent activities in some of the early like AWS and those areas. But by and large, it was a greenfield. And so we were really trying to think about things. At that time, I was part of, I chaired one of the councils. It was called AMSAC, Applications, Middleware, and Security Advisory Council. And AMSAC really had as part of its portfolio starting to be thinking about this service question that was there. And so we were lucky in that one of the CIOs who was part of that group was Shell. And Shell really sort of took this as one of the things that he was focused on. And you couldn't have asked for a better person, given that he was at Berkeley and so much of this was happening in the Bay Area at that particular time. And so Shell really was one of the people that ran with that. I think one item that I want to just sort of highlight that was an early element that was related to actually the in common world, but I think it sort of showed the power of community, was in 2011, we ended up launching the In Common certificate program. Now, you don't think much about certificates nowadays, but if you were around in 2010, 2011, you realized you paid per cert, and we were paying a ridiculous amount of money per cert. And the idea that you could have unlimited certs for one price really was a game changer, that even if you didn't end up joining the In Common certificate program, you benefited because we changed the way pricing was done. As soon as In Common came out with this, other vendors began saying, oh, well, if we're going to compete, we've got to be rethinking our pricing strategy. And this, I think, really highlights one of the real benefits of Net Plus is it helps to inform the vendor community, and it really helps to sort of change the direction that we end up going. Anyway, back to Shell. One of the things that AMSAC was really focused on was how could we get a cloud file service provider into the mix. We ended up having some discussions with a number of them. None of them at that time really wanted to sort of jump in with both feet and be a participant. And Shell and Dave Lambert ended up coming up with Box, who really became sort of that sort of cornerstone of the first, I think it was the first vendor that really Net Plus launched with, and really sort of helping to sort of set the program on its path. And from there, I think we saw success, and that success begat other vendors wanting to get interested in this. And I'll sort of end by saying, one of the things that I was doing during that time, which Kevin, you've ably, really sort of taken over and led, was I was very active in Common. I was chairing In Common steering during that 2011 through 2013 period. And we really had a business plan of how to be growing in common and how to be thinking about the importance of services. And I think one of the real benefits that has happened with Net Plus has been how, what I would call synergistic it is within Common, because we would go to vendors and say, well, if you want to be part of our community, you have to be a part of adopting the way that we want to do authentication. Up until that point, most vendors, if you were trying to do a software as a service, weren't using in common. They would say, well, give us access to your LDAP or, something like that. And we'll let you have access. And this was really a game changer in thinking about it. And it led to a number of options for helping to both grow in common, but also amplify the work that we were doing across internet too. So I'll end there on the early history side of this and let others chime in on things.
Yeah, an hour's not going to be enough because I've got about 5 things I'd love to riff off there. But in the interest of time and to hear from the real experts, I think hearing from Sarah next would be really interesting because Jack's told a really good part of the origin story. But as you indicated in your introduction, Sarah, the Cornell Cloud Forum has been going on for 6 or 7 years now. And you had not only the sort of the creativity, but also the courage to start that off. And I've only been to a couple of cloud forums, but just really curious how you've seen the landscape change over these 10 years and what you think we've learned over these last 10 years.
Thanks, Kevin. So I just have to quick warning that the UPS driver just drove up my driveway and my dogs might bark.
Pandemic
I'll try to-
blues.
Yeah, exactly. So when I started the Cloud Forum, Cornell was just starting to look at Amazon as an opportunity, and there just weren't a lot of people having a conversation about how we could work together in higher education, how we could share resources, and so it felt like everybody was reinventing the wheel over and over and over again. And so we started the conversation, and what we found really quickly was that there are some large institutions who had sort of a head start, and there were some small institutions who really didn't know where to start. And so we really worked to bring in as many institutions as we possibly could and have the conversation about how do we, not reinvent the wheel every time. How do we strategize a move from our data centers to the cloud? And do we want to close our data centers, or do we just want to have a good balance? And what is the value of the cloud? And what is the strategy? And I think over the years we've seen, a lot of institutions jumped up and said, "I'm cloud first," and some sort of even took a step back and said, "Well, we're cloud opportunistic. We want to take advantage of the cloud where it's best suited, and not just throw everything in the cloud because it's there." And so we've had lots of conversations about that over the years. We had to go virtual last year, and so we had a very, I think it was a more dynamic, much larger reach last year. And so, instead of just being 90 people sitting in a room having a conversation about cloud and how your institution can grow and change and how we can sort of rely upon each other, we had this very large community of people and still had some great conversations. And so as we go back to in-person this year, I think it'll be interesting to see how the conversation goes and what it feels like. But it's been a great sort of experience for me to just see how we in higher education really can work together on sort of common strategies, common contracts, common negotiations, common tool sets, and that sort of thing. So that's been the Cloud Forum for me.
Great, thanks, Sarah. So over the course of a month or any given month, I have the delight to rub shoulders with literally hundreds of people in the Internet 2 community, the Net Plus community, the cloud community, and beyond. And one of the newest advisory bodies that affords me that opportunity is something we call the Business Procurement and Legal Advisory Committee that Bobby is the chair of. And I'll make Bobby blush a little bit and the other committee members who are on the webinar today. But Sean and I behind y'all's back will constantly say, this group is just amazing. They're just so engaged. And at the risk of alienating some of the people in the other advisory groups that are attending today, I just love the BPLAC meetings, in part because there's a newness to understanding Net Plus with a depth, if you will. So Bobby, I'm curious what it is that you think you're observing on BPLAC and beyond in terms of what Net Plus means to you now that you've had a year or so in serving on BPLAC and leading BPLAC. What's on BPLAC? What has that been like? That sort of the mystery and intrigue is kind of going away a little bit. How has that been for you?
Well, it's actually a little different in that I have actually my whole history with Internet 2 actually started with Net Plus. Now that I think about it, because it was 2010 when I started going to my first IT forums and having conversations about it, and I arrived there thinking that Net Plus was up for 50 years. I didn't know it was just. But what I tell you right now is, the conversations I'm having right now are really about one basic thing, and that's forming true community. Having that kind of community that we have at Net Plus to discuss the kind of solutions that we all are going to have to deal with and to all play a part in that role. I think that community really drives at least the feeling I have. And I hope I have reflected that in the BPLAC. I know that I have some very capable people, Sean's one of them, who are in that committee. When we kind of make that the adventure of the committee is to improve that community, in my opinion. And of course, we'd like to do that not just in Net Plus, but also in some of the other things that I have, and I'm pointing to the wrong shoulder, to another group to try to broaden our reach, to see that, let people know that this is an important thing for them to be a part of. I think beyond the terribleness that we had with the pandemic, it has presented the challenge to most universities that they must be involved in this kind of infrastructure building if they're going to survive what's coming in the future. And so I think Net Plus has an incredibly good record for having delivered on that promise, and I hope to see it do it in the future.
Fantastic. I want to build a little bit on something you said, Bobby, and ask Jack. Bobby's touched on one of the questions that came in during registration time, and it has something to do with sort of the value of Net Plus contract, but really the value of participating in Net Plus that goes beyond the contract. So I'm curious, Jack, from your perspective, not only at UMBC, because you're very connected above campus. You've mentioned In Common and Net Plus, but you've been involved in lots of other things in higher education. I'm curious, Jack, as to what you see as the value proposition of working together in Net Plus and cloud ways that go beyond just the contract.
Well, I think actually the real key for a school like UMBC has been the community, and it's getting people engaged. And so, one of the things that we've really tried to do, and Sarah, your work in the cloud community, I know, Damien from my team has been just, really involved in that. And, that has helped us so much because we're able to sort of leverage information from schools that have so many resources that we're able to sort of learn faster, not make some of the same mistakes that others have made, or at least be aware that that's a potential landmine and try to work around that as we're trying to go forward. And I think the idea of the long-term steady state benefits that come from community, we've never been able to put a value to that. But, I would argue that actually that value is probably greater than the savings that we've ever gotten on the contracts. And the contracts themselves have been excellent. Our legal teams like those contracts. The fact that multiple lawyers are looking at it. It also has presented options that we knew we didn't have the buying power. We're 15,000. We're not going to get vendors to bend to our will. But if you have, 7 or 8 universities and you're talking a couple 100,000 or beyond students, now you are going to get vendors that are going to listen. And if all of us agree that certain contracts or issues are needed, it's just been a fabulous thing. And so I think really what Bobby was talking about, what Sarah's been talking about, it's community. It's about the fact that if you're going to just use this as a buying contract, that may be okay, but you're really losing the bulk of the value that comes from being able to participate in the rest of the community to figure out how to actually take the biggest advantage of what you're buying.
So before I turn to Sean real quick, we'll be throwing a couple of polls up, and if you could, you know, lift your head up from your keyboard. Hopefully you're not typing too much and whatnot, but just have a go at the polls, and when they come in, we'll, you know, maybe we'll stop for a moment and reflect on them. But Sean, I'm curious from your perspective, it's kind of the same question, because you and I talk a lot about this. Like we see just a slightly different angle than our stakeholders do. What is it that you see is the value beyond the contract of the activities that Net Plus engages in?
Well, the easy answer is to say what Jack said, because I think that was all. I think that was all spot on, and it makes me happy to hear that is a value. I guess I'll focus on maybe 2 things of value that goes above and beyond the contract, and I'm going to try to speak to 2 different stakeholder groups here. So one is, I think we're doing vendor management at scale in a way that's helpful to both the supply side and the demand side. Meaning for the demand side, for the higher ed institutions, you know, higher ed has historically been a place where technology innovation takes place. And I think it still is, but we're certainly seeing a shift to a lot of that innovation happening, you know, at some of the large multinational cloud corporations and things like that. So whereas we had a front seat to influence product roadmap, we're now a little bit on the sidelines. But when you're able to bring, you know, some of the largest research universities in the country, some of the largest research universities in the world together to go talk to a vendor and say, here's what we want, and represent that clearly, that's really powerful. That also helps the vendor go in, and particularly the people who work in you know, higher ed sales roles or customer success roles, go in and advocate internally at those organizations to say, here's what my customers need. So I think that vendor management at scale piece is really useful. I think the other piece that Jack hit on, which is even maybe more of an emerging or becoming more of an important issue, is helping to scale and educate and train the workforce across institutions. There's so much going on right now. Higher ed IT is being asked to do more with less. We all know that. People are leaving. I think we all know that. But we have skills across the entire higher ed community. One of the things I love working on the most are our service evaluations, where you may have a university that's really strong on accessibility, a university that's really strong on security, and they're able to complement each other in doing a review of a single service. That's really powerful. That helps us get economies of scale that, yes, may show up in pricing in the contract, but also help in workload and in workforce management. So those are some of the things I would highlight.
Well, you've all touched on elements of what I guess what I'm picking up on as a thread is that the sort of the diversity of the challenges, the challenge space and the opportunity space has increased over time, right? So if we one way that I think about it is, you know, dial back the clock 10 years, and it's kind of like this cloud thing's starting to happen. How are we going to take advantage of it? And it was a little more, I mean, it was a gargantuan problem and very, very difficult to lift. And Jack talked about, you know, some of the challenges in lifting it and getting a little bit of altitude. But what I want to pivot to now a little bit is getting your take on what the future needs to look like. So we've talked a little bit about how things started. We talked a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned and the present day value. But I think, when I look at the questions that came in at registration time, a lot of people that are attending today want to know what we think about the future. And some people have asked, what do you think Net Plus looks like, 10 years from now? And I'm going to relieve you all from that pressure, because predicting 10 months into the future in our world is very, very difficult. But that doesn't mean that we don't have some things that we would like to accomplish, some meat that we would like to cut into, and some challenges we think we need to abate. And Bobby, you touched on, I think, a really important aspect of this, and I think this is really important to you personally and professionally as well. But what do you think are some of the challenges and opportunities and things we just have to get right in terms of building the community out and reaching new folks in the future? What does that part of the future look like to you?
So that's a really great question. And I think one of the more important things that we need to do as a community is realize that we have to broaden our reach. And we need to broaden our reach, in my opinion, in two different ways. One, I think, is to reach out to schools who have not necessarily seen what Internet 2 does and what Net Plus can do for them, and give them the proposition that this is something that is beneficial for them. I certainly believe that we need to do that in the underserved community with minority serving institutions, HBCUs, tribal colleges, and Hispanic serving institutions. And so we need to make an effort, a real effort, to broaden our message. And I believe that message will hit home with many people who have suddenly realized, maybe not so suddenly, but maybe have advocated for years and now have the opportunity to say, cyber infrastructure and this thing called the internet are really important ways that we hadn't thought of. And so here's our opportunity to make our case to those institutions. And frankly, we need to lead by example with some of our vendors on how they do that too, because I think they need to understand that there's a small college prototype, an underserved institution prototype that they need to be serving and delivering processes for. Then the other thing internally that I think was not a misstep, but certainly not an emphasis, was to make sure that we include procurement, vendor management as part of the overall discussion when we talk about things like Net Plus. I think I had to end up fighting that in my institution, and I think I've done a pretty good job of giving the case for it. But I think there is a real opportunity to make sure that our procurement, legal, and business types understand what this is, why this is not just another consortium of pricing catalog, and why this needs to involve us as a participant in what we're doing. So those two challenges, I think, are there for us to emphasize and to make a better case of outcomes for the next 10 years, I think.
Thanks, Bobby. Jack, from a sort of a CIO perspective, and particularly from the UMBC, well, not just particularly, but UMBC, you've established quite a track record of sticking your neck out and putting your head into the new thing oven and having a lot of success with that. What are some things on your roadmap for what you think UMBC needs to do in the cloud, what you see other institutions, and the kind of role that we can play, whether it's Net Plus or not, how we can work together to achieve some of those characteristics?
So I think the work that Sarah is doing is absolutely essential. And you and I have talked about it, but our maturity as institutions and how we really take advantage of AWS needs to grow substantially. I mean, or any cloud vendor. I picked AWS in this case, but it could have been Google, it could have been Azure. The reality is they're innovating at a pace that every year they're sort of moving much further than we're making changes on. And if we aren't thinking about how we're going to evolve, not necessarily at their pace, but at a much faster pace than we are historically used to going, we're going to be in trouble, because we're going to be, in a sense, trapped with what looks like legacy cloud, at some point in time, because we haven't evolved into the right ways. And so I think that piece is one that I'm taking a look at and really want to be understanding and helping the community move through. I think another area that we're starting to take a look at is there too much choice? How many storage vendors should you have? Is you maybe you want more than one, but is 3 too many? Is 4 too many? That you can have too many competing products that make it harder for your users to be thinking through the collaboration space. And so I think that part of what we have to be sort of understanding, for us at least, as we go forward, is how do we evolve and rationalize what we're doing and really sort of take full advantage at the institution to solve institutional problems. It's one thing that we've been able to do. And frankly, if you hadn't created Net Plus, I don't know how we would have gotten through the pandemic, and at all of our institutions, or at least the Internet 2 community. But I think we're also learning as we got through the pandemic, now there are some things that we really have to be focusing on as we think about the next 2 to 4 years.
So I don't know if this is fair. If it's too reductionist, Bobby and Jack will jump in, I'm sure. But I think you guys have hit a little bit on the who and the what. And I want to ask a similar kind of question to Sarah. But Sarah, I also, in terms of what you think some of the characteristics of what a successful future looks like from your perspective at Cornell with the Cornell Cloud Forum. But Bobby's talking about some changes in the who. Jack's talking about the changes in the what. And I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but one of the things I'm interested in trying to learn over the next year or so as we unfold the next 10 years is, do we need to convene differently? Right? So that, the Cloud Forum started 6-7 years ago. Net Plus has been around for 10 years. But is there something about the how we come together? Because the scale and the velocity that Jack's talking about has changed a little bit. So what are some of the characteristics of a successful future look like to you, Sarah?
So when Jack was talking, I was thinking about just how much the landscape has changed in 10 years. So 10 years ago, we were worried about, oh, sorry, hold on one second here. We were worried about how, how do we move to the cloud effectively? And there were software as a service vendors out there, but I feel like in the last 10 years, that number of software as a service vendors has exploded. And what that means, at least to us at Cornell, is 1 million solutions that people can buy off the shelf, and people buying from every department, every college, and it increases the risk in our university, right? Like the risk profile at our institution has just gone through the roof. And so I feel like a lot of what Internet 2 can do as a community is figure out how to work through that risk landscape and how to sort of how to navigate that. And the risk is in places like privacy and security and data compliance and regulation and accessibility. And I know that that there's a group that's working on the scorecard, which is a huge step in the right direction. I think that's exactly what we should be able to do. At my institution, if there are scorecards out there for certain vendors, that's a place where we'll go with our governance before we can even purchase something. But I feel like that is the next sort of opportunity for Net Plus and for the higher education community to really look at that area of risk, because I think it's exploding and I think it's going to get worse. And I think it's something that makes it makes us all pretty nervous. With regard to how we might convene differently, it's interesting because we've had a lot of conversations about the Cloud Forum, and when I started it, I wanted it to be a very small, sort of personal conversation. So we limited the number of people who could be present from each institution. We wanted as many institutions as we possibly could, but only 1 or 2 from each institution so that we could have a very broad conversation. But we still wanted it to be small so that it would be, everybody could be engaged. And last year when it was remote and it was much bigger, it sort of opened my eyes to how big the demand is. And so it may be that in coming years, we need to look at opening that up and making it a larger conversation. But I don't know how to do that without losing the the just very productive nature of the conversations that happen at the size that they're happening. So maybe it's just more of that type of thing with more topics. I don't know exactly what it is, but that format has proven to be a fairly successful and productive way to have conversations and to learn things. So yeah, I don't have a good answer for how we convene differently, but I think
Well, me either. That's why I asked you.
I wish I had a great answer for you. I don't.
Well, thank you. We'll work on it together, I'm sure.
I guess
Sean,
so.
I want to ask you the same question, but bend it a little bit because in some of the questions that came in, people are interested in the near-term roadmap. So anything that you might be able to share about the near-term future, things that are, hot on our plate right now, but also open it up a little bit and talk a little bit about what you think some of the characteristics of a successful future look like from your perspective.
Yeah, that's dangerous because as Kevin knows, I occasionally write up my Jerry Maguire mission statements for Net Plus late at night of here's what we should be doing. But in all
That's a movie
seriousness,
reference. Just be
that
careful.
is a movie. That is a movie reference. It's a great movie. So in all seriousness, so in the short term, we're really focused right now. We obviously just got through a very large service evaluation for Google Workplace, and that I think we had more than 30 universities participate in some ways in that effort. So that was a really big effort, and it's interesting. Bob Flynn made a comment in the chat about things coming full circle, and Jack talked earlier about the Net Plus program. Sort of talking about, well, how do we solve file storage? And even if you go even back earlier in the history, as I understand it, a lot of this idea and collaboration came out of let's negotiate a higher ed wide, or at least a CSG wide, in that case, contract for email. And here we are again, 10 years later, back with Google, back together, trying to solve a storage issue. So I guess there is some durability there. We've turned from that as a huge focus to launching the cloud scorecard, which Sarah just referenced as a focus, and that's really intended to deal with the explosive breadth of cloud services and SaaS services in particular. That only became more apparent during the pandemic. And I think weaving things a couple of panelists said to get together, the speed at which those needed to be purchased and implemented, was certainly not something I think that many people anticipated. So, we want to be prepared to react to that and bring things in on campus quickly. I think what we're going to be looking at, if I look further along the horizon, so that's the next 6 months. If I look further along the horizon, we have to react to what I see is at least an interest in moving from best of breed point solutions to platform solutions. So many of our member universities, it is a combination of some of the best of breed point solutions to solve these problems. I'll talk about ones in our portfolio because I'm being complimentary, saying they're best of breed, the Duos and the Zooms, and the Dropboxes and those other services. But there are enterprise solutions that do all those things. Do they do them as well? Do they do them at the way in which we want them? So is that a shift? I think we need to be cognizant of thinking, is that a shift? Consolidation in and of itself is a shift. The big are buying the little, there are mergers, the vendors we work with are going public, and we're going to need to continue to react. The last thing I'll say in terms of looking forward is we need to get more mature in how we think about getting out of cloud services, or moving from service to service, or enabling, being a little more service as agnostic and enabling. I was reflecting to someone recently. I did a presentation several years ago called "Is Cloud a One-Way Street?" And obviously, sitting where I'm sitting, my answer was yes. It's a one-way street. We're never going back on prem. We did a survey recently on storage, and I think something like 40% of the people said, we're going to bring storage back on-prem. I don't buy it. Feel free to disagree with me in the chat. That's going to be part of our storage strategy. But part of our storage strategy does need to be, how do we change where the storage is? How do we be more efficient with archival and policies? And that's an emerging, I think that's an emerging space for Net Plus, not just in helping to provide services, but in helping to provide solutions and thought leadership.
Thanks, Sean. So we're coming in on the end of our time here today, and I want to ask the panelists to entertain my curiosity. One of my favorite things, one of the things that Internet 2 does and that I'm closely connected with is Ed Jerome. And I love, everybody has an Ed Jerome story, right? Oh, I was here and this happened or whatever, right? And it just delights me because it demonstrates why, you know, how it is that that's having an impact in people's lives in a really substantive way. And one of the things that happens in Net Plus is I regularly get to see the power of working together. So I want to ask each of you to very quickly share your favorite, and it doesn't, you know, Net Plus, EDUCAUSE, Cloud Computing Constituency Group, Cornell Cloud Forum, BPLAC, whatever it is. What's the working together is better when it comes to the cloud story that you've seen? So Jack, is there a moment that sticks out for you?
Well, I think the initial box rollout where we were able to sort of tap into all of the work that the early adopter schools went through in thinking about this really showed me right off the bat that the value of community, because usually you buy a product and you don't really have any way of thinking about how to be, you know, implementing. That's all up to you. But being able to tap into the community, have presentations, talk with people, understand how they thought through the process was a game changer. And from that first time forward, we were hooked.
Sarah, what's your story?
I guess I have two, and one has to do with a group that started probably around the same time that the cloud form did, or maybe a year or two after, as a little bit of a spinoff. But there was this idea that DevOps was an area where no schools had a whole lot of discussions or experience, and that we could be building common solutions. And I know there's the common solutions group, but really in higher education we could build reusable solutions. Like if I'm, you know, automating or building infrastructure as code for a specific application, why couldn't another institution use it? And so we were having those conversations and really getting to the point where we were, you know, sharing code across institutions. Of course, the adoption of different vendors and applications got, you know, kind of exploded, and that group doesn't exist anymore. But it was this point in time where I felt like we were sharing code in a really productive way, and I thought that was really cool and something that I wish we did more of, because I feel like we have a lot of sort of common discussions about our common problems, but we rarely are able to find common solutions. And so that was one of those places. But I also think a more recent favorite story is just the discussions that have been happening with Google lately. I mean, I think it's this thing that happened to all of us and we were all sort of stuck, but as a community, as higher education, we're able to move forward and try to get to a better place where we're all, you know, able to negotiate something that works with Google, at least hopefully. So I feel like that's an area where we came together and we're able to have an impact on the direction that the vendor went for higher education. So.
Thanks, Sarah. So Bobby, what's tickled your fancy? What have you seen?
Well, it's an interesting thought. I've had a bunch of things roll in my head. I could obviously go to obvious things like BPLAC, and I will talk a little bit about something else in a minute. But the one that gets me with Net Plus is that we were at Clemson, and we had an extreme need to put forth a two-factor authentication piece, and we used Dual to do that, and we did it in record time. I don't think we would have been able to do that if we hadn't had the kind of structures that were in place for us ready to choose. And it made a huge difference for us. And I know I've talked to other people and I've seen and heard of a similar experience. So I would say that's a real success story that I think we ought to be proud of. And then the other thing is the MSCC, which we've been talking about for quite some time. And what I have gotten out of that is that there's just an incredible need out there for people who are not as involved in internet too, that I want to share with. And so I'm giving the experience of having them do Edgerome installations and box installations and all these other things. And they're like, where was this all the time? I'm like, it was here. All you had to do was actually talk. And there's a community out there not only to solve your problems, but to share our failures so that you can avoid them as well. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity that we have to do now. So the outreach right now, I'm incredibly excited about.
That's awesome. I'm with you. Sean, it's kind of like asking old Mother Hubbard which one's her favorite kid, because you've probably got a trillion stories because you live this very intensely day to day. But what's one of your stories of delight that you?
I'm gonna go very early into my Net Plus timeline, but I'll preface it with about 2 years before I came to Internet 2, I was working in higher ed. I was working at a university, the one I went to, like many people in higher ed. I stayed and was working in IT, and I left and went to a tech-focused startup and said, never again am I going back to higher ed. This is great. I'm working 70 hours a week, but there's bonuses, there's all sorts of great stuff. And I got a call from Khalil Yazdi, who I think is on this call today, and said, hey, I have this job at Internet 2. You got to talk about it. And I said, no way. I'm not going back to work in higher ed. And of course, eventually I did, by virtue of me being here. And I came into the job sort of with a skeptical, like, did I make the right decision on this? Two weeks into the job, I flew out to San Francisco and met with the Box Service Advisory Board at Box's old headquarters, and sat there and just really smart people. Some of them are on the call today, so now I do think you're really smart. Ian saying he remembers that meeting. So sitting there, we're having these great discussions about how the product needs to evolve, with the product team listening to us. And it's like, this is awesome. I'm in a real life episode of Silicon Valley. I don't know if Silicon Valley was out yet at that point. And then Aaron Levy walks in, who's the CEO, and sits down in a chair next to me. I'm like, this guy's been on the cover of Fast Company. I know who he is. Here I am sitting with him at a meeting. And that spirit of collaboration throughout the ups and downs that any program has, throughout the 10 years, that spirit of collaboration still comes through. Like I remember calling my now wife that night saying, wow, this is really fun. This is going to be really interesting. And still talk to members of that group today. I mentioned my now wife, some of those people sent me congratulations emails when I got married. I don't know how they found out. I don't know who leaked it, but that is the power of community that we talked about, is building those relationships across campuses outside of organizational silos. And it's been really cool. It's been really fun.
Well, to wind us up here, thanks, Sean. To wind us up here, all of us, and myself included, have talked about the power of community. And it's real. It sounds trite, but it's real. And actually what all four of you said and shared very genuinely, I think demonstrates that. But we've got a little over 50 people on the call today, and we'll have a video of the recording out soon thereafter. And so I'd like to think a bunch more people are going to listen to it. I'd like to ask you all what you think we need from the attendees and from the community. What kind of oar do they need to grab, and how is it that they need to row it from your perspective? Because it ain't just going to be the 5 of us, right? It's going to be the 500 of us. What would your ask be of the community? And I think what I'm going to do, Sean, is put you on the spot and start off with you.
Yeah, I would say 2 things, and I'll keep it real quick. One is, sharing the power of community, sharing some of the examples that we talked about today, sharing some of the examples you've experienced in your own personal experience to amplify that message. Like Bobby talked about earlier, the community has to and is going to get bigger. the workforce in a lot of ways is changing right now. So telling people that story, bringing them in, bringing them to a call, bringing them to an event, virtually or otherwise, I think is really powerful. And I think that's an important thing, we can all do in our own little way to keep a community together and strong. And I'll leave it at that.
Sarah, what do you think?
I think those of us with large teams at our institution need to understand that the best way for us to build the community and the best way for the community to be strong is for every level of the organization to be involved. So we can have leaders, directors and CIOs having conversations about where we want to go, but it's the people who are doing the job every day who can dig in and say, but this is how we do it. And so I think it's important for us all to understand that the engagement has to be all up and down the organization, and to encourage staff at all levels to be engaged, because I think that's where a lot of the excitement comes from, and that's where a lot of the energy and enthusiasm comes from as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Bobby, how can our colleagues help us?
I think I would take the 2 points that have been made, which I totally agree with, and I think need to be emphasized in every way we possibly can think of, and think not traditional expansion. Look beyond yourself, look beyond your normal stakeholders, and include those people that you think might be adversaries in your process, but really are advocates in waiting. So I think that that's an important role to play. And then something Sean mentioned earlier before that I really want to pick up on is our workforce development has to improve. And this has to be one of the ways that we do that. It's time that we took the young entrepreneurs and leaders of our campus and include them in the part of this so that they can grow and expand and become the kind of people that we are and that we look up to. And so I think that's incredibly important to do in this light of the great resignation and great resignation that we're going in right now. We're losing people everywhere. We have to pump people back into the bottom half of this and create new leadership, new workforce.
Jack, how do you think folks can help?
So I think it's about, again, community, but it's also recognizing that together we can do things we could never have done alone. And we talked about the Google, but if we hadn't had the ability to bring everyone together and work as a group and share, we wouldn't have been able to make the progress that we made with Google. And so I really think that as we're trying to be looking at Net Plus, it's about getting people re-engaged in the Net Plus activities, taking advantage of service advisory boards, and really helping to sort of change the way that vendors want to deal with us. I mean, this will be an ongoing activity, and we need that next generation to sort of come in and take ownership of this and really help lead us to the next level.
Well, thank you all. That was a great way to close our hour today. We'll be looking at programming other events in the rest of the fall and into 22 as well. So we're plotting the course for the next 10 years, and we'll need your help. One last poll, if you could help us out here as we data gather a little bit, as we begin to have conversations with our advisory groups at the end of 21 and get ready for our work plans, the development of our work plans in 22. I want to thank you all for attending today. I especially want to thank Emily Nichols and Tara Jenis, who've been instrumental in helping to pull this off behind the scenes. Wouldn't have been possible without either one of them. So thanks again for attending, and we'll see you around the Zoom calls and whatnot. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.